for being here this evening for this discussion on international trade and investment rules and the ways in which they threaten to impact traditional democratic processes at the state, national, and local level. To some, this discussion might not seem very relevant to lawmakers at the local level or the state level because international trade doesn't apparently intersect with state and municipal duties. It's pretty much in the federal bailiwick, at least that's what everybody thinks. And up until a few years ago, this would have been quite true, but as you will hear tonight, state and local lawmakers are rapidly becoming the new players in the globalization debate as they begin to understand the potential erosion of their lawmaking authority as the result of these trade agreements. For almost a year now, I've been chairing the Senate Select Committee on International Trade Policy and State Legislation, which is a committee that was established by the California Senate to try to identify the ways in which and what of our laws could be at risk because of international trade agreements. The committee works to examine ways in which we can support and maintain our state legislation while developing some effective strategies for shaping the trade debate in a way that even recognizes and respects our lawmaking authority. As the debate over economic globalization moves out of obscure policy summits and onto college campuses, the front page, labor halls, small towns, street protests, it's imperative that elected officials at all levels of government understand the impact of trade globalization and their part in it. Now, there's no question that trade is important to our economy, but we would maintain that that trade has to be fair and that it not sacrifice the rights of workers, consumer safety, environmental protection, human rights standards, public health, and general safety. Additionally, trade rules must not undermine the traditional checks and balances set out in the United States Constitution and the Federalist tradition that makes, well, our state, California, and its cities global leaders on issues important to our constituents. So why is this important to local and state officials? Well, I understand now that these agreements are actually, in many ways, less about tariffs and quotas and more about what governments can and cannot do in the way in which they legislate. This current debate is not, as it's been posed in the press, an argument between free trade on one side and protectionism on the other. It's over the legitimacy of and the need for regulatory balance and over who provides that regulation. Because trade agreements place such an emphasis on the free flow of goods, local and state laws passed in the name of the public good could be seen as barriers to trade and therefore challengeable under trade rules. For example, a government ban on a carcinogenic substance could be seen as a barrier to trade because it limits the manufacturer's ability to sell that substance. This is exactly what happened. Good timing as the mayor of Santa Monica walks in. This is what happened in California after the city of Santa Monica and others successfully worked to phase out the carcinogenic gasoline additive MTBE that had been contaminating water supplies through the state, including a number of our wells in Santa Monica. And when Governor Davis banned the inclusion of MTBE in gasoline after 2004, under a little-known provision of NAFTA, Chapter 11, the Canadian producer of Methanex, which is the M in MTBE, filed suit against the United States because of California's phase-out, claiming almost $1 billion in future loss of profit. And that claim is currently being heard, as all of these claims are, in a private dispute resolution court by unelected trade officials with no public access to transcripts or the arbitration documents. The state can't actually participate as a party, and the decisions are not appealable in a court of law. If the tribunal rules in favor of Methanex, taxpayers in the United States could be liable for that sum, $970 million. Or California could be put under some pretty exquisite pressure to revise its law or reverse its decision, or even told, you cost us $1 billion, how about we take $1 billion back from your transportation funds, because we can't tell you what to do with your laws, but after all, there's a lot of federal money at stake here. And we are only represented, as I said, we can't defend ourselves in this suit. We're represented by the United States government, who are the same folks that brought you this treaty and this provision in the first place. So, and if you think the MTBE thing is a worst case scenario, consider the city of Guadalcazar in the state of San Luis Potosi in Mexico. City and state government there denied the United States-based metal-clad corporation a permit to expand its hazardous waste facility after an environmental review discovered an underground water source under the proposed site. Filing suit under NAFTA Chapter 11, Metalclad claimed that the permit denial infringed on its right, undermined the value of its investments, and the NAFTA Tribunal ruled in favor very recently of Metalclad a little over a month ago, and the Mexican government was forced to deposit $16 million right into the company's coffers. Now, we may have a chance to change the course of these trade agreements. Last April, as many of you know, the United States began negotiating the Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA, a 34 country-wide trade pact that would expand NAFTA to the entire Western Hemisphere. The assessment that local and state officials could offer during these negotiations is made all the more critical because U.S. trade representatives are expanding FTAA rules into precisely the area of most relevance to local governments, the delivery and regulation of services including water, energy, and health care. So I believe that local officials can play a role in adding some balance to the trade formation process. And this discussion tonight is intended to provide lawmakers and advocates and interested folks with an overview of these issues to stimulate a bit of debate, to answer several key questions. What are the most important trade agreements and what areas do they impact? What are the government functions and regulations most likely to be threatened? And how might city and state officials get involved in the trade policy debate? Today, when trade agreements have profound consequences for the environment, for food safety, for labor standards, for social values, for public health, it's important to find a middle ground that brings us the benefits of a global trading system while respecting and strengthening our democratic institutions.
I have been a council member for 9 years, and I am very involved at the National League of Cities. And at the National League of Cities, which is over 1,800 cities and towns throughout the United States, we've had an international task force for many years, and they've been working on economic development and slowly getting into the idea of what's going on with these international trade agreements. 2 years ago, I was asked to go on a trip to Europe to learn more about trade agreements, and particularly the World Trade Organization and what the cities and states and nations, if you will, in Europe are dealing with that. It was a real eye-opener for me. I was the only elected official. They spoke in a language I had no clue what they were talking about half the time, and I learned a great deal. And I learned to be very concerned about what these trade agreements mean for local and state entities. Trade is a good thing, and that's where we come from at the National League of Cities. But we also realize that we don't have a whole lot of voice on these trade agreements with our federal government. And we need to get to that place where they hear what we're doing at the local and at the state level and why our concerns are valid. I wanted to give you an idea of some of the policy that we have at the National League of Cities. And this is very, very new. In fact, I just got back Sunday from our annual conference in Atlanta, and this policy was just adopted into our national municipal policy for cities. Our basic belief is that we, the National League of Cities, are committed to both sound international and national trade policies and effective state and local economic development strategies. And those international trade and multilateral investment agreements should be in harmony with those local initiatives and must not curtail the ability of state and local governments to explore and develop policies and regulations that ensure the public good. What you and I, as citizens of our cities, think is really good, sometimes the federal government has no clue. They don't do it, I believe, on purpose to hurt us. They just don't understand and know those things that matter to us. We believe very strongly that the federal government must talk to us at the state and local level and understand, before they go in to negotiate these trade agreements, what they could possibly do to us at that level. We have two recommendations to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. First, we would like them to increase the transparency and openness and the due process in their policy and negotiations on these trade agreements. We want them to release the text, the draft text of those agreements, before they're negotiated and put into law. As of now, that doesn't happen very often, if at all. They're getting a little better at it, but not much. So we find out about it after it's already been adopted, which doesn't do us any good. And finally, we'd like them to provide local and state governments with technical assistance and resources to educate people about these agreements, and also to allow us to have a voice in what's going on. We have some general concerns and then some specific concerns, and I'll go through those rather quickly. The disclosure requirements. We oppose any requirement that says that we have to disclose our subsidy programs, procurement, how we buy things at the city and state level, and any other local regulations, either to the World Trade Organization or any other international group. The reason we say that, it's not that we're afraid to be open. It costs a lot of money to do that. And the federal government's really good at what we call unfunded mandates. You do it, and you pay for it. But we're going to require you that you do it. And we have a problem with that. Legal standards. We want the United States to advocate for trade rules that contain, and this is really important to us, legal standards that are consistent with the U.S. Constitution and applicable case law. Many times the standards are much higher than our own Constitution, and so the question we have is, whose laws are sovereign? Our United States laws or somebody else's? We believe it ought to be our laws, the laws that we pass, and that our government should not sign anything that goes beyond those. And finally, that there be transparency in claim resolution. As Senator Kuehl was saying, here we have the MTBE problem, and the state of California, who is the one that is actually being brought up for sanctions, if you will, although it's the U.S., has absolutely no voice. No voice to stand up and say, we, the citizens of California, believe that this is the best thing for our environmental protection. And how dare you tell us we can't do it? So we think that's very important. Some specific agreements, and these first ones are all part of the World Trade Organization. One is in subsidies. Right now, the subsidies and countervailing measures prohibits government programs designed to favor domestic entities. And what that means is we believe that there may be programs at the local level. When I say local now, they use that term to mean city, county, state, because we have a very different system than many other countries do. So local is all of those. We may have some subsidy programs that we're hoping they're not going, right now they're just at the national level, but there is a chance they may decide to bring those down and prohibit them at the local level, and we don't want to see that happen. On procurement, again, going back, you know, we sometimes, many cities have a saying, you'll see a sign that says, live and work and shop in your community, you know, keep the dollars local. And sometimes we have some laws on our books that say, if possible, please buy, we're going to buy in our city from companies in our city first. Well, if they bring these procurement laws down to the local level, that would be prohibited. We could not do that. On services, there are some problems with this. We believe that the U.S. should study the effect of current restrictions on local government before expanding anything further. So far it isn't to us, but it may be. And this is on things like basic infrastructure services. Who we decide to contract with for roads, water, things like that, government service sectors, hazardous waste management. Someone told me if they brought this down, anybody could decide who their trash hauler would be. So you might have 12 different trash haulers in your city because each of us individually could decide which company we wanted to go with. Could cause a lot of problems. Finally, on investment, and this is with NAFTA, and it's called their Chapter 11, and it's on investments. This chapter mandates that national and subnational laws must be least trade restrictive on a private investor, or they can bring claim for financial damages against that country. This is the MTBE lawsuit suit that's going on right now. We're afraid that when the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas is done, they're going to bring that down to the local level. And for locals, that's a real problem. One of the differences, very quickly for you, at the World Trade Organization, if someone wants to bring sanctions, they believe they've been hurt, it's country against country. And that makes countries pause a bit in deciding whether they're going to bring sanctions against another country, because you bring them against me, I could very easily turn around and decide to do the same thing against you. So countries think long and hard before they do that. On the level of NAFTA, it's corporation or investor against country. Well, corporations have no such reticence about bringing these suits, as you've seen with the MTBE suit. And that's a real concern for all of us in local government as they start to negotiate the free trade for all of the Americas. So we're really going to be watching that. I'd like to really thank Senator Kuehl and her staff and our state government. I want you to know California is way ahead of the game. It brings me great pride when I go to the National League of Cities to be able to say that. Many other states are not doing, well, most other states, Washington is one that is doing a lot with it, are doing nothing about this. And I'm really proud that our state is, and they're looking out for us. So I look forward to a partnership between our state and our local entities in the future. Thank you.
The two previous speakers, of course, have given a very excellent overview of some of the problems in relationship to the international trade agreements. I'm taking a little bit different approach because I think the two mantras that are stated, are you for free trade or fair trade? And I think I'm here to say that they're neither free nor fair in this country. We really have a problem on our hands that we need to address. Following the ministerial in Seattle, I was offered a 6-month grant to begin examining trade activity at the state level in Washington State. It was apparent to us that the global trade agenda in this country had a base, and that base appeared to be rooted in state government structure. And if we were to be effective participants in or challenging the new rules, that we had to become well educated and understand this system and how it works. Our state governments participate not as direct participants, but as almost unwitting contributors to as promoters and funders of a variety of programs at the state level that are subsidized and that are supported by state public funds. Groups within the state that were involved in Seattle and Washington State with agriculture, human rights, and forestry and fisheries, and all the issues affected by the WTO and other agreements were active at the global level. No one was examining the state-level activities of trade promotion, trade policy development, or trade agreement compliance. How were we being driven into this and drawn into this, these trade agendas? What influence or participation did our elected state representatives have in this national activity and global activity? Did they understand the things that were developing, that threats were developing to state lawmaking? Did they even know what we knew about international trade agreements? During the WTO ministerial, letters were sent by members of the Washington State Legislature, city, state, and county officials, and congressmen from 3 states to President Clinton, demonstrating their exclusion from the development of these trade agreements, expressing their disagreement with some of the issues and they stated as follows, quote, "We wish to communicate to you in the strongest, most possible way our view that the WTO, its operation and activities are inconsistent with many ways with values which we consider to be fundamental to our democratic republic. Our constitutional responsibility to the people we represent cannot be secondary to the objectives of international trade. To date, state, local, and tribal governments have not been officially informed nor engaged by the USTR's office on these ongoing and important negotiations," end quote. Of course, this prompted a 4-page letter from Charlene Barszewski, the previous trade representative, where she stated, of course you've been involved. You have a single point of contact. The single point of contact in our state is the Washington State Trade Representative. Clearly, we had our work plan before us, engaging and educating the state elected officials, examining the relationship between the USTR and our own state trade representative, and understanding the role of all the actors involved at the state level in trade policy development. This has not been easy. When I interviewed the state trade representative, he questioned, "Just what are you all about? Informing the public?" In my research, I have never once used the Freedom of Information Act request. All the information I have obtained was public information, even though on occasion I was told that what I was looking for was proprietary information and was easily obtained from lower level staff. Understanding this process is critical to democratizing globalization. Understanding the infrastructure of the global agenda is at the bottom line, and it begins at the state level. How are we citizens contributing toward the rapidly advancing global agenda? With our tax dollars and with the lending of our elected officials' status. Remember the cry, "Follow the money"? What we found, among many other things in Washington State, is that there is considerable public investment in subsidizing trade promotion activity, considerable public financial resources maintained overseas offices, for maintaining of overseas offices for the state agencies of the ports, and the state agencies and ports actually have 21 offices in overseas cities, and the Commodity Commission has representatives in 20 countries. Considerable public investment in state university programs that target trade promotion and intellectual research and intelligence research in forestry, wood products, and agribusiness. Public and private partnerships centered around trade promotion activities abound and make it difficult to determine when they say "we," who are they actually referring to? The public sector or the private sector? And both have very different constituent groups and responsibilities for accountability. This confusion actually has led to Washington Council on International Trade, who actually invited the WTO to our state and obligated the state, counties, and cities to millions of dollars without the legal authority to do so. And this was borne out by an investigation following the WTO in Seattle. Our investigation has found that the state exempts $45 billion in tax exemptions, deferrals, and differential rates from major state and local taxes on a biannual basis. That export activity alone enjoys a $518 million tax exemption for this year alone. There are billions, and those figures come directly from our Department of Revenue, and I have a copy of our tax exemption report right here. There are billions of dollars of public funds being invested in freight mobility improvements without a nickel from the private sector, even though the original agreement to fund these projects has a private sector component. Not one nickel has been spent from the private sector to enhance these freight mobility improvements. The state elected officials lend their support and stature of their office to promote trade for the private sector. For example, our past Secretary of State, whose sole responsibility is to oversee elections and maintain and certify public documents and guard the public seal, the state seal, and has engaged in extensive overseas travel, participated in foreign affairs in North Korea, China, and Russia, and conducted direct lobbying for major corporations such as the Boeing Company. There is confusion as to how these trips were paid for, part public, part business, and some from his own pocket. The state trade representative that I mentioned earlier, actually the state legislature has been concerned because that person who is the single point of contact to the USTR's office in Washington, D.C., is only accountable to the governor. They failed when they enacted his position to require that he come to the state legislature and report to them about his communications and his actions with the USTR's office. And February this year, January, before he left office, the State Legislative Trade Committee invited him to come and testify. And their bottom line question to him was, what have you been doing for 3 years? We're the Trade Committee. Why haven't you come to us about any of these trade obligations that we now are under? And finally, we have learned that the state legislature, legislatures, plural, in this country, have been effectively circumvented in the development of trade policy. And I would go so far as to say that they have been strategically and intentionally circumvented in the development of these trade policies. How many people want to wrestle with the state legislature on critical issues? The debate bogs down and it's very difficult. But they have been very efficient in developing these trade agendas these global trade agendas. When viewed individually, these citations that I have summarized are not surprising, but when viewed collectively, I think we have a problem. We have worked with the Harrison Institute and Robert Stumberg, who I know has come to California and worked with you as well, in our efforts to educate members of our legislature. I have interviewed dozens of state officials at all levels in determining the state's activities and the public costs of these activities. We are currently preparing 10 separate reports on the funding and the detailing of some of the trade agenda for our state. Our one report on subsidies that are unknown at the WTO level was delivered by David Badker, the director of APEX, Asia Pacific Environmental Exchange, to Doha's Ministerial. The report is titled "The Tip of the Iceberg: Hidden Government Support for Exports in the State Level of Government," a Washington State case study, and there's copies out on the table for you of that report. The case study was very well received by those wanting to better understand the real trade distortions that occur in the global scheme of things. Following the September 11th events, I, as well as a lot of other people, have scrambled to understand whether anyone would listen to the concerns that we have at our governmental level and on these global issues. In searching for new meaning to all that we have now been confronted with, I came across a very important report published by the National Foreign Intelligence Board under the authority of the Director of the Central Intelligence and prepared under the direction of the National Intelligence Council. The report is titled "Global Trends 2015, a dialogue about the future with non-government experts," and links globalization with global and national security. Their first report, their analysis changed dramatically after their first report, which came out in the year 2000, forecasted trends for the year 2010. And in their current report, they state that globalization has emerged as a more powerful driver than they predicted in 2010. The Global Trends 2015 sees international economics dynamics including developments at the WTO, and the spread of information technology as having much greater influence than portrayed in the previous 2010 report, and that the Global Trends 2015 pays attention both to the opportunity for cooperation between governments and private organizations and to the growing reach of intellectual, criminal, and terrorist networks. The report clearly indicates that the benefits of globalization will not be shared by all, and that, quote, regions, countries, and groups feeling left behind will face deepening economic stagnation, political instability, and cultural alienation. They will foster political, ethnic, and ideological and religious extremism, along with the violence that often accompanies it. These are chilling statements from a report published December 2000. As was stated on an interview on the Charlie Rose Show after the September 11th event by an astute individual, there is a burden of not knowing, and now we're confronted with the burden of knowing. We as citizens in America have a lot to understand and learn about our country's foreign trade policies and how it affects other people. We have a lot to understand, and thank heaven that work has already begun with all of the people here and the people that in our state who have taken a serious look at what all of this is doing to and for all of us.
Hi, Michael Feinstein from Santa Monica. Kevin and I will split our presentation, and in the interest of full disclosure, before I became aware of the problems with our trade agreements as a council member, I was one of the people who marched in the streets in '93 and '94 against NAFTA with the Coalition for No NAFTA, helped coordinated by Professor Robert Benson, who's with us, and the Fair Trade Network today by Leon Hankey. We should give them a hand. And I would go a little bit further even than my friend Bev Perry here and suggest that we have seen 2 decades of wrong-headed trade legislation out of both Democratic and Republican administrations on the federal level. I think people don't get the logic, and the illusory side agreements that we were told would fix everything in '93 and '94 haven't done the kind of things that we're talking about tonight. So I don't think we should believe the rhetoric we hear, and I think that present company extended in the Congress, too many people are bought and sold out to serve the economic elites, and that's where these trade agreements go. Santa Monica is a very unique city, and the reason that we're a poster child here for this issue, we produce a lot of progressive things because we are a self-contained small community. Part of the reason we're a self-contained small community is that we have had our own water, unlike all the communities that got pushed into Los Angeles earlier in the last century. We had our own water for a long time. That's why we were able to develop independently. And the MTBE crisis, MTBE was the oxygenate additive to gasoline, supposedly to make it burn cleaner, but it pollutes water. This was done by the oil companies to avoid going to renewable fuels in the late 80s, early 90s, when all the clean air mandates were coming forward. It was the way of not keeping burning gasoline. Well, it leaked into our water, it polluted our wells. We were 70% water independent. Now we're only 20% water independent. It's over $3 million a year now to buy extra water to replace the water that we have. The oil companies are paying that, but we're looking at an over $200 million cleanup bill. They're all fighting among themselves. We have to sue them all to get any of them to start paying for it. Meanwhile, we're still at risk because we're in a desert. The problem with a city like Santa Monica and these laws is, as Senator Kuehl reminded, all the problems we have with the Methanex Corporation trying to sue this country and taking $1 billion of taxpayer money. It is a chilling effect prospectively when a city like Santa Monica continues to be on the cutting edge of environmental and labor and health and safety and social laws, but then we see them being undercut by this kind of trade legislation. What that does is it takes away the incentive for cities like ours to pass those laws. And when individual cities don't have that incentive, then we can't learn from our diversity as communities on this planet. So not only does it hurt us looking back, but it also chills us going forward. And for that reason, our council acted, and Councilmember McKeown brought a resolution to us regarding that.
Thank you. I'm Kevin McKeown, City Council member in Santa Monica. And on July 24th, Mike and I brought to our City Council, and our City Council passed a resolution opposing the extension of the NAFTA agreement to the Free Trade Area of the Americas for this very reason we're talking about tonight, the loss of local sovereignty. Part of that resolution we passed, the Council does hereby request that the state legislature investigate NAFTA and the proposed FDAA. And that's why we're here tonight. I want to thank Senator Kuehl for that, because this is a response to what we and some other cities have raised and what Senator Kuehl herself well knows to be a problem for local jurisdictions. As Clint Eastwood once said in one of his movies, now it's personal. The way it got personal for Santa Monica was through our water. Few people get to have personal hands-on experience with international trade treaties, but we did. It began one morning in, I think, 1996 with a twist of the wrist in the morning. We went to our taps to turn on the water to make coffee, and for the first time in many, many years, it wasn't our local water that came out of the tap. It was water from Northern California and from the Colorado River, with which we've been making our coffee ever since, because our local water was polluted with the MTBE. So our position has always been that it certainly isn't the fault of the people of the city of Santa Monica that this was allowed to happen. We shouldn't pay one dime for that MTBE cleanup. And our aquifer is very seriously polluted at this point with that. The oil industry is the one who caused this pollution. We feel they should be the ones who pay. The polluter should pay. The people should be made whole, and that's been our position. So the primary concern for us in what's happening here with NAFTA is our ability to follow through on that, which is local sovereignty and local control over local issues, and for us, our local water. The resolution that we passed in July opposing the extension of NAFTA to the FTAA highlights Chapter 11, which has been talked about, which permits corporations to sue government in these trade tribunals, which aren't like normal courts because there's no real opportunity for us as the harmed party to have any say in what happens. What this will do, as Mike said, is have a chilling effect on future legislation, because what's happening here is a liability to the government for a supposed taking through its regulatory action to protect its own citizens. The migration of these Chapter 11 provisions from NAFTA into the FTAA is even more serious for us in terms of local issues. As far as we're concerned, the claim that the Canadian company that manufactured the pollutant, it's called Methanex, is making through NAFTA is just a backdoor way to avoid their liability for what they and the oil companies have done to Santa Monica's water. And we feel that it is the duty of us as elected officials to protect the people of Santa Monica from environmental harms, and we've done a pretty good job in Santa Monica for the most part, so this is a very vexing problem for us. If Methanex were to succeed in their NAFTA claims, this would gut environmental law in our country, and that's a very serious threat that I hope we all understand. If they win, it'll be impossible for California or for local jurisdictions to do the right thing by the people who live here. California acted very reasonably and very methodically in enacting the ban on MTBE that's supposed to take effect next year. So we are asking that California hang tough. We need the help, we need the support. In a state like California, where the drinking water is already limited, we can't let drinking water just be lost. We have to act before the public loses more of the drinking water, and we're certainly not the only community that has gasoline stations with MTBE located over its aquifer. So we want to be made whole, and NAFTA could block that. Is that an accident? Is this gift of protection to multinational corporations that we don't locally have ourselves an accident? I think there's some pretty good evidence that no, it's not an accident. It was actually part of what was thought of in the beginning when NAFTA was pushed through. It's about limiting the authority of government, and that is one of the central importances of what NAFTA does. There is a strong right-wing advocacy that feels that whenever the government enacts a regulatory measure, it should compensate whoever might have made a profit, even if it meant harming people. Well, we stand against that, and I really want to thank Senator Kuehl for the work that she has done in helping to get the MTBE ban in California, and now in standing up with us and with other local jurisdictions in making sure that this sticks.
Two closers here. One on the back table outside. New York Times did a very extensive piece earlier in the year that you'll see as a large reprint that talks about several cases where the secret tribunals are doing this. And the other thing I would say is I hope what comes out of this is, given the sinful passage of fast track during this past week, that we put enough pressure so that this issue is so in the face of lawmakers when that vote finally comes for the next round, that all the kind of concerns that we want to see are either in there or the thing goes down.
One of the things that I'm trying to do as a member of Congress is to take information from Washington, D.C. about our policies back to the community. And when we talk about international trade, when we heard all the discussion on NAFTA, did you really understand what it meant? When it comes to California, a nation state, a Pacific Rim trading partner, and the 6th largest economy in the world, everything that we do will have a greater impact on California than any other state in the Union. And because we're so far away to the west from the nerve center in Washington, D.C., it's incumbent on all of us to come and bring the details and the information back to you. So thank you for holding this particular forum this evening. I am very concerned, as you who follow the news, you know that Fast Track got off the floor last week, the floor of the lower house. When the clock turned to 00.00, that means voting should end. They held the rolls open at least 20 to 25 minutes. The vote came out 216 to 215. We had the 215 early on, and we thought we had won. We wanted to kill the bill because what it does, it puts into the hands of the president the authority to negotiate trade policies. In a time of war, like we are in now, do we trade a lot of these policies? We wanted to get into trade agreements for their alliance to work with us as we fight this war on terrorism. And we wanted to have the ability to slow down the agreement, to oversee it before it was finalized. We lost that. But the good news is that it goes on to the Senate, now in the hands of the Democrats. But you get a lot of blue dogs and yellow dog Democrats over there who don't have the same concerns that we do because they're thinking locally, and we know that all politics is local. What we want to see in any bill were protection provisions for the people who work at producing, constructing, or whatever it is they do. They did not get into the bill. So we're hoping in the short period that we have left that the Senate will be sure that they get in. I, too, am concerned about the sovereignty of California. And we have been known to take the lead in passing laws that protect the environment, that protect negotiations, also that deal with Chapter 11, Chapter 13. And do these agreements override those laws that the largest state in the Union have put into force? And so I think that we have to pause and we have to look at these agreements. We have to have some way to stop them. So we need that oversight so that a state like California that's been very much involved in environmental issues don't have those provisions ignored when we have a trade agreement. And I can go on and on and on with the other issues that come into play. But what I'm going to work with Sheila Kuehl and the California state legislators on is being sure that in Congress we have an oversight committee patterned after very much what you're doing, that we hold the proper hearings. But that means we have to take the House back next year. We intend to do that. And then I think in doing that, we can set up these watchdog committees to look at our trade policies. And, you know, we were very concerned when NAFTA passed. It was something that President Clinton wanted. And we thought in his hands we'd get a better deal. I don't trust the hands of this administration when it comes to the provisions in these policies. And should we put that much power in the hands of the presidency? Because Congress does have a role to play, like the legislature has a role to play here in California. So I want you to know that we will continue to raise the questions. We'll continue to bring the information back to you. We intend to protect the sovereignty of every state, but most of all the state in which we serve. So I thank you for the opportunity to let us hear the input that's coming, Sheila, and we will be following and we'll be working together. I receive your letters. And by the way, I think our mail is going to come from the outside. It's been held up since October the 15th. And so because you faxed it, we got it. Those that had a stamp on and went the regular route, we have not gotten yet, and I'm sure there'll be thousands of letters from many of you. But we will take into consideration your concerns, and we will be trying to have some kind of agency that will oversee these agreements so that they will not denigrate the laws that we put in place, the good public policy that all of the people want. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Blackshaw?
I'll just make a few quick points because the speakers here have done an excellent job sort of giving some background to trade agreements. Really, I just want to let you know about the two big issues, agreements that are coming up, and how we can sort of be working towards the future in changing the nature of the trade agreements to ensure that they contain protections for state and local governments. As Sheila mentioned earlier, there's the Free Trade Areas of the Americas, which is a hemisphere-wide trade agreement that was launched in April. It is essentially an expansion of NAFTA, and it would apply to all 34 countries of the Western Hemisphere with the exception of Cuba. It's been very difficult to know exactly what is in that agreement because they're all private documents and they're not released to the public. One of the things that we've done with our committee is try to get some access to those documents. So we can't even tell you exactly what's in those, what's proposed in those agreements, except that it looks a lot like what we've seen so far with NAFTA. So keep your eye out for the FTAA. The other real interesting and problematic trade agreement is the GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. And this is the agreement that would have the most potential impact on local governments and state governments because it's an agreement that has to do with regulating everything from postal to transportation to education to snow cleanup, everything that traditionally is done by government. So under a whole broad market access and national treatment and all sorts of legalistic stuff that's really hard to understand and keeps these trade agreements, it's tough to have rallying cries around, end Chapter 11. It's hard to sort of find a unifying theme around these trade agreements. But again, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, it's one of the agreements of the WTO, and again, it will have great impact on state and local governments. We have a real opportunity to ensure that these trade rules don't infringe upon local and state authority. We've got lots of materials. I thank all of you for coming.
One of the things I learned a lesson hard on as serving in public office was that as I watched environmental laws be watered down, enforcement be very weak if it existed at all, was that the citizens of our country and our communities work hard. In general, they work hard, they pay their taxes, they comply with the regulations that government sets forth. And I decided that the greatest sin of all was the violation of that public trust. The people of the United States trust their government, and the role that government is playing in our lives and have been in our lives is diminishing. I've been a critic of government in the past, but right now I think that because of the civil rights situation that we're talking about, that we've got to pay attention to what our government is doing and how we define that, how we decide where we're going to come down on those issues is very, very critical. The World Services Congress, you've probably never heard about that because I learned about it from a friend in Canada. The World Service Congress was held the month before the WTO in Seattle, the same year, in the 1st of November. That Congress was a collection of 800 representatives from 50 countries in the United States to deal with the question of services, the General Agreement on Trade in Services. And they said it was to assist government to make a transition and to reduce their role and allow the private sector to take over the role of serving services in the world. That Congress was co-chaired by Al Gore and Charlene Barshefsky. And I could not find an article anywhere in this country about that event. It never came up during the campaign for presidents. So how do we trust? How do we trust our governmental structure? Take a look at Enron. look at it carefully, watch it fall, read about how it's falling, why it's falling, and who had responsibility for oversight. Arthur Anderson Associates, who reports to the SEC on the activity of corporations so that investors can feel confident in what they're doing. They're all out to dry right now. And one of the comments made by the SEC person in charge of the office in Washington, D.C. said, "I've been overwhelmed to try to keep up with all of the responsibilities as a government agency to maintain this oversight." He says, "I only have 20 people in my office." Well, that's a diminution, a downgrading of a very important function and the health of this country's economic investment world. So all the people who have invested online, all around the country, all the dutiful taxpayers who comply with the requirements that are upon us, that's what's at stake here. We've got to pay attention, we've got to understand, and we've got to look at the details. Thank you.
We need to do something about this, and the first place is to get a lot of people understanding what's going on and knowing that it matters to them in their lives every single day. The second would be to ask your city representatives in whatever city you live in, ask them if they know about this. Ask them, do they know what trade agreements could do to city policies? And if they don't, have them call me. I'm in the book. Have them call the National League of Cities. Have them call the League of California Cities and say, what's up with these trade agreements and why should I care as a city official? We'll tell them why they should care. Lastly, talk to your congresspeople, and unfortunately, since Fast Track now has gone through in the House, talk to your senators and ask them if they know what it truly means to you as a citizen and someone who lives in a city. And ask them not to abdicate their responsibility to you. They represent you, and they ought to have a say about what goes on with these trade agreements, not just the president. And it may be my party, but I will tell you, given the corporate backing of this president, I don't trust him on this.
Just very quickly, it has been said that we need to know exactly the content of these trade negotiations, and they need to be open to public examination and how they respond to our own social policies and concerns. We need to know their impact on the regulatory environments, union working conditions, economic subsidies, environmental policies, consumer safety laws, and tax policy. So on the national level, we need to monitor these trade agreements. We need to have a say in them, representing all citizens in the United States. Congress needs to have a say in them. And we need to protect regulatory sovereignty of our state. It needs to have intense scrutiny. And we need to know how globalization will be changing our lives for the future. That's what we're all about as policymakers. We abdicate our responsibility if we cannot protect our sovereignty state by state by state. Thank you.
What can we do is answered in different kinds of pieces depending on who we are. Each individual, I think, has a place in their organization, in their community. If they're elected in their city, in their county, or their state, what I'm supposed to do is different from what you're supposed to do. Not different in its goal, but different in what I can accomplish. Although it's never as much as I really hoped when I first ran for office. Democracy is a very messy business. As much as we keep talking about how we love democracy and we think it ought to be protected, it's exactly what happened with Fast Track. You got democracy. People get their arms twisted. And so I think the smartest thing for us, and many of you here have been in these battles many years, is first of all to understand that whatever the agenda is, a conservative agenda or a right-wing agenda or a corporate agenda, it's the same as it was last year and the year before that. And it is a clash of ideas. One of the wonderful things about being in government is that I'm engaged every day in a clash of ideas. And sometimes my ideas win, and that only happens when I get one more vote than the other guy. And sometimes my ideas lose, and that happens when I don't get that vote. And that's why I talked about, I'm not really as much of a critic of the process as many others are, because although I do see people's arms get twisted and I do see them get promised things, it's a big mistake for the public to think that that's the business of government. The business of government primarily is about convincing individual elected people to do something that's in their own interest. So the work, I think, of your organizations, of you as individuals, and of us as elected officials, is to make certain that we've got these real understanding of the outcomes of some of these things, and not ever to give up on it. I used to train advocates, and I tell them they only need 2 words. I'm back. And you know, because you've been there a lot. The other thing I would recommend to everybody, all of us at the table and you here, is to eradicate the word should from your vocabulary. It's one of the most useless words in argument that I've ever heard. The way the world should be, or what people should do. You know, I've got my dreams and wishes too about the way people should act. But it's not useful to talk about shoulds. What we need to talk about are the actualities. People need to be taken from where they are to where you want them to be. And telling them they shouldn't be where they are doesn't get you there. And I think that the grassroots organizing that so many of you have engaged in have brought this issue to the forefront, have made people worried, have made people understand. But this notion, I mean, do you remember the original movie of Rollerball, which is being remade and brought out again? Rollerball was about not international games, but intercorporate games. There were no nations anymore in this James Caan movie. Go see the remake that's about to come out and see what happened to the politics. Because they want you to go to sleep, and you're not going to go to sleep. Thank you very much, Congressmember Watson. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. So I will, and the committee will, first of all, the request to work with organized labor and to meet with groups together, I'm for it, though I am not the one to put that together. Organized labor needs to figure out if it can organize itself, and you bet we'll show up and work with them. But, you know, for me to call a meeting of all organized labor, I don't think it's the right thing. So make it happen, we'll be there. You disagree? All right. Well, we can be used. I mean, you know, we ask people to come meet, they do, and we're willing to be used. In addition, we're certainly going to do our best to petition our senators and other senators about fast track and to continue to educate about it. But remember, take this advice about talking to your local elected officials. You never give up on them. Make certain they understand this problem. And the committee will continue to function, we'll continue to have hearings, and we're not going away either. So thank you very, very much for being here for this discussion.